Hi students, this lecture is going to be on the principles of design. So here are some learning objectives for this lecture. We're going to go just basically over the key principles of design, and this will prepare you for the collage assignment 2, as well as the elements of design lecture that's also posted. So today we'll talk about unity, variety, scale, proportion, balance, and there's 2 types, symmetrical and asymmetrical, emphasis, and rhythm or repetition. So we'll start with unity, and all of these definitions are overlapping with the ones in your book as well as the ones in the other PowerPoint that's posted. So unity in the work of art occurs when design elements are similar or identical. So that makes sense, right? Something is unified. So which elements, design elements, seem to be unified here? And so remember, this is the principles of design that we're talking about. In the other lecture, which covers the design elements, basically the principles of design are use different elements of design to create things like unity, for instance, as you see here. So which design elements are unified here? Well, one might be line, right? So we have line repeated over and over again. So repetition is also seen here, but the lines are all the same size. This is where we're seeing similar or identical kinds of elements used to make the design unified. So line, color, so it's not a huge color palette. It's reds, yellows, blues. And it's just one hue of blue, one hue of red, one hue of yellow, not varying. So that is a unifying element. Shapes, so we have a lot of rectangles, some squares that are produced, not a lot of different shapes, very unified shapes, and then space, the way that things are placed, where rectangles are placed throughout the composition. There's not a lot of variations here. So this is where you have a composition that is very unified. On the other hand, we have variety. So variety is achieved, it's basically the opposite, when design elements are varied in size, color, shape, texture, etc. So using the design elements, but making them different, right? So which design elements might be varied here in the work by Kandinsky? So similar things, shapes, different, right? There's not just a bunch of similarly shaped squares and rectangles. Here you have shapes that are different shapes, circles, wavy lines. So line is another element that is very different here. It's not one kind of width of line, it's different colored lines. So color is different as well, different colored shapes, different sized shapes. And then the space, there doesn't seem to be any unification within the composition. So this is where we see variety achieved in design elements. Scale and proportion. These are other really great elements, or principles of design. So scale describes the dimension of an art object in relation to the original object or objects around it. I like to talk about this one by talking about an artist named Julie Meretu. She's a contemporary artist, so she's still working today. This is the funny thing about teaching an art history or art appreciation class, is that us professors usually get to show you a huge image, if we're in the classroom, and here on your computer, everything is skewed as well, right? So you see this and you think, oh, I wonder how, you have no idea how big it is. For you, it seems like, oh, it must be rather small, right? That's why it's always important that us professors try to include dimensions often, so that you can see that this is actually really big. This is what we would call a large scale painting. It's 80 feet long by 23 feet high. And this is just a detail. And I could put it on the screen if you were here with me and you'd say, oh, it must be huge. But actually, it would be a lot bigger than a screen if I had one behind me. So here you actually see it in its atmosphere, where it actually existed in 2010. And it's basically the whole side of a building. So pretty cool. And this would be large scale. So this is large, right? Here's another way to think about scale. So Do Ho Seo, who's an artist who oftentimes works with scale and the manipulation of scale. Here you see a work that's shown with, I had to add an image with a person looking at it too. But you can see, you know, the artist has sculpted these huge legs that come through the ceiling of the gallery, and then they step on these tiny people. If you look closely, there's people who are running out of the way. And so this scale is completely altered. So obviously human legs are not usually this big, and obviously human people are not usually this small. And so the artist has manipulated the scale, you know, how big things are in relation to other things, to make a point. And this is called karma. So these people are about to be stepped on, right? Perhaps thinking about something that this population has done, and now karma is coming back to get them. They're about to get trampled by these giant legs. And I do remind you, I go through artists pretty quickly in these because I want to keep them short for you, but I do encourage you, if you like an artist, to go ahead and do your own research, look in your book, look elsewhere, and find out more about other artists if you're inclined. These ones typically creep people out, but I always do bring them up when I talk about scale. So these are also large scale sculptures of people. These are not real people, but they look insanely realistic. So this is what we call photorealistic. You probably remember that term from our very first lecture. Basically, when an artist makes something look so realistic that it looks like a photograph, it looks like the real thing. So this is an artist named Ron Mueck, boy and girl. And so, you know, manipulating the scale so that it's this huge human that seems to be crouching and trying to hide. So, of course, this seems to be, of course, this figure cannot hide, right? Because they're almost too big to hide behind anything in the real world. And so kind of make maybe a commentary of sorts on, you know, our inability to hide sometimes. And then here we have a giant baby, and some of you might think this looks rather grotesque. If you've had a baby, you probably know that this is actually how babies look right out the womb. They're swollen. They just went through the birth canal usually, so they don't look great. They've been stuck sometimes in the birth canal. They're covered in slime and goo, amniotic fluid. So, you know, making this on a large scale, maybe getting us to think more about the process of birth, birthing, and also the human body as a baby. So, but also just gigantic scale, a huge scale for this artist. And now let's talk a little bit about proportion. I did post a video on this sculpture by Polykleitos. It's called the Doryphorus, or the Spear Bearer. This is an ancient Roman piece of art. Actually, it's ancient Greek, but this is a Roman copy. And this has everything to do with proportion. So please watch that video so you get a better understanding of why this is such an important piece. There's another key term that comes up in that video called contrapposto. And we'll talk about it in a second as well. So proportion refers to the relationship between the parts of an object in a whole. The Greek sculptor who created this piece, his name was Polykleitos. He was not just a sculptor, he was also a mathematician, a scientist, kind of a Renaissance man. And so he used mathematical measurements to measure the human body, and wrote this really important text called the Canon, in which he describes the perfect proportions of the human body. And he says in this text that it is based on math. So humans have specific proportions that can be broken down into kind of mathematical problems. So both the text and the original Doryphorus statue were lost, but both proclaim that each part of the body is a common fracture of a figure's height. So this would look something like this. So Polykleitos in his canon text would say, okay, the head is about, a body is about 7 times the head, right? So you can see the measurement of the head fits into the body 7 times. And he would say, okay, well, the arm, or the foot up to the hip bone would be about 4 heads, right? And then 2 more heads to get to the top, to the top of the bottom of the chin, and this, and so forth. So basically breaking down the proportions of the human body into mathematical elements, so that proportions can be completely correct. Now, does anyone really look like this? No, absolutely not. This is completely idealized and stylized. Obviously, no one's perfect. No one's abs look like that. And I don't even know what this is here, this muscle that seems to be protruding. But you know, the ancient Greeks were really really excited about the shifts that they were making in 400 of the common before the Common Era, because they were working from, and you'll see this in the supplemental video that I posted, that I just was speaking about, and this is a screenshot from it, but this is what they were working from. So the archaic ancient Greeks who were working 100 years before the classical period, this is how they depicted people. So that's not very realistic at all, right? It's very rigid. It might remind you of kind of Egyptian art where the figure looks straight ahead. You know, there's no real emphasis on realism or movement or the way that the skin falls over the muscles of one's body. So this is a big shift for them. And the key term that does come up in the video and that I'll share now is called contrapposto. And I'm sorry I haven't included it here for you to read, but you'll see it in the video as well. And that's the S curve of his body. So you can see this is how you and I would traditionally stand if we're relaxed. If I was standing like this and I was straight up, you would be like, you don't look very relaxed, what's wrong? However, if I was standing with one knee bent, one arm bent, you know, my hip kind of moved to the side, as you see here with the doryphorus, that's a much more relaxed and natural way of representing a human body when someone is standing. So this is really important. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, we talked to him about him a few times. He also had a study of human proportion. This is called the Vitruvian Man. You've probably seen it. It embodies all the qualities of design. So the human figure works inside the circle, which works inside the square. And as the limbs move, right, these it works within these elements of design. So here we see symmetry, proportion, ratio derived from the perfection of the human figure. So the limbs fit in perfectly. And you probably have seen this. So it's actually, this is the logo for the Doctors Hospital at Renaissance here in the Valley. So, and why might that be? Well, they're probably they were looking for a symbol of optimal health. And of course, the Vitruvian Man is kind of a good idea for that logo in that sense. Balance. So balance refers to the even distribution of weight in a composition. We've already looked at this piece by Ellsworth Kelly before when we talked about space and positive and negative shapes, space, that kind of thing. You can also there's balance in this composition, but balance can be symmetrical, it can be asymmetrical, as you see here, and it can also be radial. We're going to talk about two types, actually three. We'll talk about radial, but the two that are assigned for the collage are symmetrical and asymmetrical. Symmetrical balance is achieved when objects are reflected or repeated on either side of an axis. This is known as bilateral symmetry, but you can also just write symmetrical balance. So the Taj Mahal building you all probably know about is one of the most symmetrically balanced buildings in the world. Each facade is actually identical with openings that give the building a sense of weightlessness. So if you were to make an axis right down the middle, even the gardens are very symmetrical. And usually we talk about this in terms of two-dimensional work. So I always like to bring in the Taj Mahal, which is actually a tomb, because it is a building that actually shows this as well. Here's an interior view. You can, of course, look up the Taj more if you'd like to know more about it. This is the example that's used in the PowerPoint. So I just wanted to bring it up here. And here's the definition again. Bilateral symmetry is used to organize a variety of smaller figures and decorative shapes around the central figure of the Virgin and the Christ child. And so here we've actually used a red line to show the axis here. And of course, not everything is perfectly the same. We don't have a perfect symmetry here, but the design elements are divided in half. So you do have, you know, two different angels on either side. However, they're still organized in such a way where you have bilateral symmetry. You can also have asymmetrical balance. That's the second type that we're going to cover. This is when a composition lacks symmetry, but it can still be balanced if sides possess the same visual weight, and this is called asymmetry. Asymmetrical balance is achieved when different shapes or forms in a work of art are arranged in such a way to create a sense of balance. So you can see here this kind of graph showing how this might work. So for instance, if you have something small that's really dark on one side and then big that's really dark but in the middle, you know, that's a way to balance it, and so forth. So let's look at an artwork. This is different from the one that they show that is shown in the other PowerPoint, but I want to show a variety of examples. So here you see Vermeer, the artist, carefully arranging various shapes and hues to create a sense of balance. So how does this artist do this? Well, just as the graph that we just looked at says, so half is really dark and half isn't, right? There's this huge dark corner down here with this dark blue kind of drapery. But then in the opposite corner, you have a very dark painting, right? And so those are kind of balanced out. On the other hand, the brightness is balanced out. So we have this window that seems to be open right here, which is super bright. And it reflects onto this woman, onto her face and her chest. And it illuminates her face and the fur of her coat very brightly. And so we have a balance here because it's bright on one side and then bright as well on the other side. The interesting thing about this too, so the visual weight of lights and darks create balance in this composition. The other cool thing about this painting is not only does it show us balance, it's also about balance. So its subject matter also references balance. This woman is weighing her jewelry. As you can see in her hand, she's got a scale. So she's weighing her jewelry using a scale itself, a balancing scale. And then if you can see in the background, I don't know if any of you recognize what this painting might be of, but many people at this time would have recognized this because, especially in this context, in the 1600s, in Western Europe, where religion, religious paintings were very, very common. This is a painting of Christ. You can see Christ here at center in a heavenly realm. And this is supposed to be a painting of the Last Judgment. And what happens on the Last Judgment? Well, Christ is, the story goes, is going to weigh everyone's souls and decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. So this painting is not only exemplifying balance in composition, but also makes us think about balance in subject matter as well. And so the idea is that she perhaps might be weighing her jewelry, not trying to get too attached to earthly objects like her jewelry, like these fine objects, because of course the reminder behind her in the painting is that none of this will be necessary, none of this will be useful when she is ultimately weighed by Christ on Judgment Day. We also have radial balance. This is where everything radiates outward from a central point. You often see this in church rose windows. Here's one from Chartres Cathedral as an example, and you can see where it would actually be in the cathedral. You've probably seen these often if you've ever studied Gothic or Gothic church architecture. So that's another way to establish balance. Emphasis, this is a way of directing a viewer's eye to the most important aspect of the work. That's a typo, sorry. Artists often emphasize using size, color, placement, or contrast. So if we were together in class, I would ask you, what do you look to first in this painting by Anna Valère-Costière? Probably the lobster, right? It's not only in the foreground, I mean, so is everything else, but why do you look at it? Probably because it's super bright. It's orangish red, kind of vibrant, and then surrounded by kind of these greenish blue tones. And of course, those are complementary colors, right? So as we know from the lecture on color, where we talked about color and the other design elements, elements of design lecture, we know that complementary colors actually work to make the color pop more. And so because this bright orange red lobster is surrounded by hues of green, right, we know that green and red are complementary, and so they work well together to really make the lobster pop. Also, it's placed at center, it's right there, it's large, right? So these are other things that make a painting give its emphasis. We've talked about this one before too. Where's the emphasis here? right at Christ's head, right where it should be, because he's the most important person here. And of course, we talked about this with linear perspective, where we can actually follow the orthogonals all the way down to a vanishing point and a single point, which is right at Christ's head. And so oftentimes a composition will lead us there in a variety of ways, and here we have placement used as well. This one I don't want to talk about too much because I know that this is going to be a long lecture, but this is another really important work that helps us to think about emphasis, and focal point is another word that we oftentimes use in art. This is called The Execution of the Defenders of Madrid, 3rd of May, 1808, by Francisco Goya. This is a Spanish artist, and this is actually painted a painting that's supposed to reflect a real event, which is basically the French soldiers coming into Spain and trying to overtake Madrid, the city in Spain, and basically killing innocent bystanders. So here you have the French soldiers coming in. Their backs are to us, and their rifles point right towards this fellow. So you could talk about implied line here too, because who's the focal point? Probably this guy, right? So not only do we have implied lines pointing through the barrel of the guns at him, he's also the brightest. So we're using contrast here, lights and darks. His shirt is bright white in an otherwise very kind of dark composition. And of course he raises his hands, so he definitely seems to be the emphasis, the focal point in this painting. And, he also is giving us the same, and, this is a time when religious paintings, religious themes and subject matters would have been very, very common. So everyone would have known that this, whether or not you were practicing Christian, you would have known that, would have seen this kind of stance as the raised arms out in a cross formation like this as to be mimicking that of Christ on the cross. And so here, this fellow is kind of, so the artist is using this visual iconography of Christ on the cross to emphasize the kind of the humanity of this man who is being sacrificed, right? Just as the story goes, as Christ sacrificed himself. You also can look to, oops. You can also look to his palms and see that he's got something that looks like a stigmata, right? So if you look closely, I've zoomed in, there's a dark spot on his palm. And of course, if you know anything about the stigmata of Christ, you know that these are the symbols that told people that he was Christ after he was risen. And so the nail holes in his hands are one of those stigmata. And so you even have reference to that here in this painting. So very smart composition in terms of Francisco Goya really thinking about people's understanding of the iconography of Christ and one of an innocent person sacrificing themselves. And that's what you have here happening with these citizens of Madrid. Artists can also, can there be an art that doesn't have a focal point? Absolutely. Here's an artwork by Lucas Samaras called Room Number 2, the mirrored room. So basically you'd enter into it and it's mirrors everywhere. There's a table and chairs that's also mirrors. And so if you enter in, you basically can't find a focal point, right? So it's mirrors upon mirrors upon mirrors. And then we call this afocal, or this is something without a single point of focus. Only 2 visitors can enter at a time in this mirror room. Viewers and the work become inseparable. So you are part of the work because you're in a mirror, right? So you lose your own individuality. And there's literally no focal point because there can't be, because everything is just reflected over and over and over again. And this is called afocal. Oh, so this is the last principle that we'll talk about, rhythm and repetition. Rhythm or repetition occur when similar shapes or forms are repeated within a work of art. Rhythm is the visual beat or tempo within a work of art. And here, this is the image that we have in the PowerPoint as well. This artist presents viewers with a loop of repeating shapes that just kind of seem to keep going, and your eye can kind of follow this rhythm within the work. And it's even called endless rhythm. So obviously the artist kind of sees what they're doing. Repetition can also imply monotony, so it can become boring because it just is over and over and over. But if certain elements are used repeatedly, they can also create a rhythm. So these two are very, very intertwined. And to think about this, we can talk about Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol, we will talk more about him later when we talk more about printmaking as a medium. He's an artist who used repetition often in his work. You've probably seen his famous Campbell soup cans from the 60s. So why not just represent one soup can, right? And of course, he has other works where he just does represent one, but instead he's representing all of these soup cans. And for him, this was because it became monotonous. It became like, okay, there's more and more soup can. And for him, he actually ate soup, Campbell's soup like every day growing up. So that was like his dinner. So it's a comment on kind of the ways in which food became, what's the word I'm looking for? Nothing is homemade anymore. Basically, even your food isn't homemade anymore. And, you know, in the 60s, this is when people started doing a lot more grocery shopping where they wouldn't make their food necessarily. People are going to work and then coming home, and then you have to have food ready. And so this is a reference to his childhood, but also is a reference to kind of pulp culture, obviously, and the commercialization of food, the way that we can now go to the store and buy the same exact food that someone else is going to eat by buying the Campbell soup. So he does this a lot in his work with pop culture references, advertisements, right? This is essentially could be like an advertisement, but because it's in the gallery, it's art. So we'll talk more about this in other lectures as well, and we'll actually talk more about that piece as well. The last piece I wanted to look over was another work by Andy Warhol called Green Car Crash. This one too uses repetition and rhythm. This is actually a photo that Andy Warhol took from the local newspaper, so he did not produce this image, but he took it and then printed it. And we'll talk about printmaking later. But he basically made the print over and over. So you can see it here, here, here. It overlaps a couple times here. And then in the end, you can't even figure out what it is. So here's the original photograph. It is a car crash. You probably didn't notice there's a man hanging from a pole. So it's apparently there was this horrible car crash. This photograph was snapped and put in the paper, and the man from the car was projected from his car and somehow got projected onto this pole and is hanging from a nail. So that's pretty horrifying, but it's once we realize what's happening. But the idea behind this piece is that, okay, you see it once, you see it twice, okay, you see it a few more times. By the time you've seen it like 10 times, it's not that horrifying anymore. And the idea behind this for Warhol is that this is how kind of images of violence work, and this is how advertisements work. It's like you see them over and over and over, and we become desensitized. And this is in the 60s when things weren't quite as bad as they are now. Now we're exposed to images of violence all the time, even as children, accidentally often. So he's getting us to think about that and how images of violence in our culture are everywhere, and we become desensitized. And here the printmaking, the way in which a print is made, which is like it's repeated, also contributes to the idea behind it, which is that over time we become desensitized to anything. So we'll talk more about these later in the class as well, but I just want to give that to you as an example of repetition and rhythm. So let me know if you have any questions. I hope you have a great day, and we'll talk soon.